Welcome to the book club where the size is just right, the books aren't too long, and you never need to host. That's our job. We bring best-selling and award-winning writers of every genre to Twin Cities metro area libraries to share their stories, discuss their work, and answer those burning questions you've always wanted to ask your favorite authors. This is a book club where we don't have to argue about what the author meant. They can tell us. The book club that doesn't require a clean house or wine and cheese. And in this book club, if you haven't read the book, it's all right. Although, we hope you'll be inspired to pick it up next time you're in the library. I'm your host, Slade Kemet, and you can consider the book club rewritten because this is Club Book. Club Book is made possible by Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, MELSA, and Library Strategies, part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. We would also like to thank our partnering bookseller, Red Balloon Bookshop. This podcast features Alafair Burke at Scott County Library, Prior Lake. Fans and critics alike credit Alafair Burke with some of the most believable psychological thrillers and police procedurals in modern fiction. Her hallmark authenticity draws heavily from Burke's professional background as a professor of law and former deputy district attorney in Portland. Her literary debut, Judgment Calls, in 2003, introduced mystery aficionados to Samantha Kincaid, a lawyer in Multnomah County, Oregon's Drug and Vice Division with bona fides markedly similar to Burke's own. Burke's impressive backlist also includes the 5-entry NYPD Detective Ellie Hatcher series, which the New York Post calls perfect for law and order fanatics who want ripped from the headlines intrigue. Burke is also the co-author alongside mystery titan Mary Higgins Clark of the Under Suspicion series. Over the past decade, Alafair Burke has also devoted considerable time to standalone thrillers. Her latest, The Note, follows 3 friends on a Hampton Beach vacation that goes terribly wrong. In a starred review, Kirkus Reviews raves Engrossing, Burke builds an intricate structure of secrets layered within secrets, revealed for maximum suspense.
Thank you all so much. I'm like, she knows I'm a big loudmouth that doesn't need a microphone, but thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. It's really nice to be in Minnesota. I'm very proud of myself today. I walked 4 miles in the Mall of America. I didn't go outside, however, till like 5 p.m. I was like, oh, this is how people do this. And I'm even more proud of myself. I only bought one thing, and it was for my husband. So I feel, who's better than me? I don't know how many author talks you've gone to, but I think a lot of people are curious about how someone even becomes a writer. How long have they wanted to be a writer? How long did it take? A lot of my writer friends start their origin story sounding like they always knew they wanted to be a writer. It was the only thing they had a passion for. Like, they make it sound like they emerged from a womb, like with a pen in hand, ready to start Act 1, climax of the story in mind. I'm not that writer. I kind of became an accidental novelist. My first book came out 22 years ago. I've written 15 novels on my own. I wrote another 7 or 8, I think, with Mary Higgins Clark. I kind of have to pinch myself when I say that because I didn't plan it at all. So the story kind of begins with, how far do I go back, I guess? I think you can't be a good writer without being a reader. I meet so many people and they're like, I'm trying to write a book. I've always wanted to write a book. And I said, well, what do you like to read? Well, I don't really read much. I'm like, well, good luck with that. It's like, I love to, I'm going to be a famous chef, but I can't taste any food, I always was a reader first. And I think, I wouldn't be a writer if I didn't read first. And so my entry into life as a reader is then I really did emerge from the womb ready for books because my mom is a librarian. They're still present tense, they're still alive. So whenever I say was, it sounds like they're not, but they're retired. But my mother, when she worked, was a librarian. And my father was a writer and is still a writer, present tense. So some of you may know, so my father is named James Lee Burke. I hear his books are very good. If he keeps working at it, he might just have a shot at a career. No, but when I was born, nobody had heard of him. Like, I'm sure some of you have not heard of him, but the people who have know that those were some pretty good jokes. When people ask me what my father did, I always said my father's a writer. And how did I know he was a writer? It's because I saw him doing that. His real job, I realize now, is he was an English professor, but I thought of him as a writer. And before that, he was a social worker, and before that, I think he worked on an oil field. He had different jobs. But in his heart, he really was one of those people who wanted to write his whole life. And the impact I think that had on me is I would see him doing that. And so a lot of people, it's just unimaginable that you would tell a story, let alone, take the time to write it all down. And so I think seeing him do that made it seem like a natural thing to do. It also meant, because he was a writer and my mom was a librarian and they both loved books, that we were a house full of books. And it was natural that we would read. And my mother, I realize now, I thought it was special time just for me and Mom. So I'm the fourth of 4 kids and the youngest by far. So I was kind of the one who still needed to be watched. I don't know what those other kids were doing. They were probably, because they weren't around on Saturdays during my special mom time. But she would take me to the library every Saturday for a new stack of books. And I realized in retrospect she was doing that to get my dad writing time. That was the bulk of his writing time, is like all those crazy kids were out of the house and he could just have quiet time and try to crank some pages out. And so I kind of credit both of them for at least instilling in me that love of books and the idea of books being a regular part of your life. But I never thought I'd be a writer. And I think part of that is because I was the fourth of 4 kids and the youngest by far, and probably the one who took the most interest in books. My father probably made the mistake of telling me when I was really young and telling me repeatedly, you're going to be a writer. You're going to be a writer. And so, my friends who say that that's all they ever wanted to do, they had parents who were like, are you insane? Like, you can't be a writer. Like, you can't, nobody's going to pay you to write books. Like, you need to go be a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer or something normal. And because I had a father who was saying, you're going to be a writer, I said, I want to be a lawyer. That's like my act of rebellion was I'm going to become a lawyer. But that was a little further down the line. But so we moved from southern Florida to a place called Wichita, Kansas, when I was in the 4th grade. And that would have been 1977, I think, something like that. And I didn't want to leave for all kinds of reasons. One of them had to do with I was convinced I was going to marry Andy Gibb. That's a very long aside. They found me crying. They found me crying when we were going to move, and they thought I was crying because, you'll make new friends. You're going to have, we'll have a bigger house, and you'll have a nice school, and you're going to make new friends. They thought I was crying all about my friends, and I was like, but Andy Gibb. And it turns out that I found out at some point that the Gibb brothers, you guys all look like you would know who the Bee Gees and Andy Gibb are, right? Okay. I can't tell this story to a lot of people because they have if you don't know who Andy Gibb is, none of this works at all. But the Gibb brothers lived at least part of the year in Key West. And because we lived in southern Florida, that meant we went to Key West once or twice a year, which meant I had every chance of meeting Andy Gibb, having him fall in love with me, and waiting for me to be old enough to marry him. And then, I was sure that was going to happen. So anyway, I didn't want to move to Wichita. We moved to Wichita. We get there, I find out there's no Gibbs and there's no ocean, and that was a problem too. And I never really did fall in love with Wichita, but they kept just trying to rationalize it. It's safer here. We have a nicer house. You have a better school, things that little kids don't care about. And then I feel like in my head, at least, we were still unpacking the moving boxes, and the local news comes on. My parents still have the news on 24/7. It's not good for your head, but they always had the news on before there was even cable news. So the local news was on, and I still remember it. It's like, the Wichita police are confirming tonight there is an active serial killer. And I was like, what? I'm like, no Gibbs, no ocean, but a serial killer. And they had a map of where by then he had killed 6 people that they knew about, including a family. And they had pins on the map, And by then I had kind of figured out where I lived. And I was like, Mom, Dad, like, I think our house, this nice, safe house you moved me to, is in the middle of those red dots. And I'm like 8 years old, 7 years old, I guess, at the time. And my fourth grade is what? 9. I was 9 years old. And most parents would turn off the serial killer news from their 9-year-old daughter. My dad's like, Pearl, turn it up. And because he's still like that, it's like he wants the information and he's not going to hide it from his kids. And the police announced that there was an active serial killer in Wichita, Kansas. They had not released the news yet because they were trying to convince themselves it wasn't all related, even though if you read about this case, it was definitely all related. And he had given himself a name. Does anybody know what case I'm talking about? Yeah. BTK. There's a new podcast out now by a former news anchor from Wichita, is the hostess of it, called Monster, and it's aptly named a series. But he called himself that. He wrote letters like something from a bad, pulpy serial killer novel. He would write letters to both the police, and when the police did not give him enough attention, he wrote it to the local news. Wanting attention, wanting everybody, he wanted to be famous. He said, how come everybody knows Son of Sam? Everybody knows the Zodiac Killer. Like, I want people to know about me. Why aren't you talking about me? So I need a name so I can be famous. And BTK stood for bind, torture, and kill, which is what he did. And I'm 9 years old finding this out about my new safe neighborhood. And it was around that same time that my mother, my personal literary curator on Saturdays, who would help me find books, that I suddenly wanted mystery books. Like, I knew about mystery books from the librarians here will tell me if they still have these books. The Encyclopedia Brown series, those are like the most fun little short stories, like this little kid who goes around with his like tough female friend, and they'd like solve all these mysteries on the block. But the fun part is like at the very end, like he would have the solution, and you would have to see how did he solve it, and then you would flip to the back and you would find out how Encyclopedia Brown had solved it, and did you figure it out? So I loved those, and I wanted more and more and more of that. And so my mom was like, what is this kid with the mystery novels? And so age-appropriate mystery novels meant Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, and eventually Agatha Christie, and then Mary Higgins Clark. Oddly enough, I was allowed to read those at a pretty young age. Then they finally just decided let her read whatever she wanted, and then I started finding the really dark stuff, Flowers in the Attic. Like I was reading all kinds of dark stuff at a young age. But when I look back on it, I think that even as a child, that attraction to mystery novels, wanting those stories, it was scratching some kind of itch in me that like in the middle of those books, it's confusing, the clues don't add up, everything feels dangerous and scary and chaotic. But like the payoff in those, final 5 chapters is, oh, it all makes sense now, right? All of these clues that I've been absorbing, like they've all come together, and there's some kind of closure, there's some kind of restoration of order, right? It's not always like perfect justice or a perfect happy ending, but you get the solution. And I think that is why I was hungry for that kind of a book, even at a young age. So, all right, that's my therapy of myself. I just analyze myself of why I've been so obsessed with this form of novel for so long. But I still didn't think I'd be a writer. I just was a fan of the genre. My dad started to write crime novels, and sometimes I wonder, because he wasn't particularly into crime novels either, and around the same time he started to appreciate them. And he wrote his first crime novel, I guess I'm gonna say I was maybe around 1987, something like that. Someone can fact check me. But late 80s, and I still wasn't thinking of myself as a writer. By that time, I really was like, I'm just gonna, read a lot of assigned reading and be a good student and get good grades and go to a good school. And I did all those things. And then I wound up going to law school. And I had lots of reasons for wanting to go to law school. But when I finally got there, I found myself interested in, guess what? Criminal law. And it was almost the stories behind the cases themselves that would intrigue me. This was before you could Google something, but I would go into the the old newspapers and pull old newspapers, like, why did that guy do that thing? What's the real story behind Terry versus Ohio? What was going on? And I was very curious in those human stories behind the crimes. I was also still kind of had that itch of wanting closure to criminal cases, like open criminal cases to be solved. And that brought me to the district attorney's office in Portland, Oregon, which I did. I clerked for a judge for a year, and then I went to that office to get some trial experience and to kind of see what would happen. I worked there for several years. I worked as a domestic violence prosecutor primarily, and then I was assigned as a community-based prosecutor, which meant I was basically a 50% advisor to the police department. I worked out of a police precinct, and half of the time I would go to community centers like this and ask how we could help make their neighborhoods feel better and safer. So it was a nice job. But during all those years I was at the DA's office, I was still enjoying reading mystery novels, which is still the bulk of what I read, is crime novels. And I inhaled all of Sue Grafton's Alphabet series and Sarah Pretsky and Marsha Maloney and all of those female-led series. I read those they were my crack. I can't get enough of those. I'd find Kat Kajewski, which I still don't know why she stopped writing, but for those of you who like those books, she had 7 books in the 80s and 90s that are just candy, so good. Jan Burke, not related to me. But anyway, all those books, I loved them so much. And then Michael Connelly, I discovered him, and Harlan Coben, and just kind of was reading all of these books all the time. But one thing, as much as I enjoyed them as a fan of the genre, one thing I noticed is I'd be speeding right along with some kind of great procedural novel, but every time a lawyer showed up, especially if it was a prosecutor, it was like, you could just skip the next 5 pages. They would show up, and it's just a lot of exposition, a lot of hearsay, objection, no, you need a warrant, a lot of technical information. It became kind of like my little pet peeve because I knew from my time at the district attorney's office that the bulk of your time is not spent in the courtroom. A trial is the exception, not the norm. Those formal rules of evidence, like hearsay and objection, are things that they're the toolbox you need to own and know which tool to use at what time, but it's not where the action is. It's not where the big decisions are made. The really important stuff happens in the hallways. It happens in the relationships that cops make with DAs and vice versa, and the relationship that prosecutors make with defense attorneys, knowing which judge to go to for what, knowing how to get it from one judge's courtroom to the other. A lot of it is behind the scenes kind of informal stuff and strategy and working things out. It's the stuff that happens in the hallways and in chambers and off the record. Cops talk differently under oath than they do in a formal setting than they do when they're out in the field. They talk differently to each other than the way they talk to witnesses, than the way they talk to DAs, than the way they talk to judges. And those voices, kind of that rhythm of what happens behind the scenes in a criminal case, that had become instilled in me, kind of a granular still, it's been 20 years almost. And I still kind of know the heartbeat of those cases and what they look like. And so whenever I would get to a book that didn't seem to get that, that they thought that what the DA did was just go to court, I was like, wow, you blew an opportunity there to do something kind of interesting. And Linda Fairstein, she had that series set in New York. Alexandra, what's the main character's name? I don't know. But Linda Fairstein had a DA series where the main character was a DA, and that showed all the behind-the-scenes stuff. But most books would kind of miss that fun part of it. And so without really thinking about it, it was one of those things where I was like, well, if I were going to write a book, it would be a DA, and it would show how the courtroom stuff matters, but it's almost like sometimes it's a means to an end, not the end itself. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then before I knew it, I started looking at the world around me a little differently, of just oh, I see how I could use that as a scene, or I could see how this judge, could be interesting in this kind of way if I fictionalized him or her a bit. And then before I knew it, I was one of those annoying lawyers who was like, one of these days I'm gonna write a book. And I started in my head just kind of imagining it. I didn't write anything. Is anybody here wanting to write or has tried to write a novel? it's very difficult to kind of, I don't mean, it sounds like woo-woo writer or BS, but it's like, it's very hard to create a mental space to write if you're stressed out about other things. Like if the rest of the world just feels like it's sucking you up in all sides and in all directions, it's very hard to like create time, and not even just time, but mental energy to, I am going to turn off all that real life noise and allow myself to occupy this completely fictional space that I control and actually try to write something down on paper to advance that world. And so as much as I would play with the ideas in my head, I never wrote a word while I was still practicing. And I always emphasize to people, it's not because I was at work like 90 hours a week and so that all I was doing was coming home and sleeping. It really was just drain. It was like, because I was in the real world of criminal justice and like getting phone calls from domestic violence victims all day long. I mean, imagine what that's like. When I went home, all I wanted to do was like scarf down some dinner, watch Seinfeld, and go to sleep. You know, it was just more of a willpower thing of just I don't have anything else to give in terms of storytelling, because that part of my brain is just being tapped out. I want to be a passive recipient of stories when I go home, if that makes sense. But so I didn't start writing, but I imagined in my head a world that would be interesting if I were to ever start a book. And I quit my job at the DA's office. I moved with someone to New York. He's long in my past, but his career brought us to New York, and I followed. And I started working at a law firm, and even though I was working more hours at the law firm, I didn't feel so emotionally exhausted at the end of the day. I didn't have that kind of personal investment in fighting about money all day at work. I think I almost wanted a different environment in my head when I got home. And I decided, like, you know, if I'm ever gonna start that book, I'll start it now. This was before people all owned computers. I went and bought I think about it now, it's like I went and bought a computer, like just so I could write a book that no one might ever read. You know, I bought some cheap computer knowing I would only use it, you know, as a word processor basically. And when I had time, I would write a few pages here and a few pages there. And some days, the person I followed was a doctor, so he was gone a lot. And like when he was gone for 24 hours, I'd write in my pajamas all weekend, you know. And before I knew it, I had about 200 pages of a book that was set in the Portland DA's office. The main character's name was Samantha Kincaid, who has my sense of humor, but comes up with the jokes faster. Like any funny thing, I think, for a whole year went into one book, and she says it all in a week. So like she's a stand-up comedian and a DA. But she runs a lot faster than I am. She dresses like me, but is like 2 sizes smaller. Like she was like, I'm just gonna be like the perfect me in this book. And I set it sort of in my office, my old office. And I look back on it, and it was set in Portland, Oregon. And I look back at it, and I think part of why I started that book was I missed that world, like the world that had once exhausted me. I was kind of like, oh, now that I'm in this kind of pampered law firm life, I'm like, I kind of am missing the darkness. I'm missing the stuff that's exhausting. And I miss my friends at the office. I miss Portland. And it was like kind of a way for me to escape, like where I couldn't do that when I lived in Portland. I just needed to just rest at night. Like I wanted to kind of go back to where I was, and I was doing that through writing. I probably had the most fun ever, to be honest, writing that first book. It didn't have a deadline. There were no expectations. I didn't have my editor's voice in my head. I didn't have readers' expectations in my head. I really just wrote it for myself. Like what book would be fun for me to read? And I wrote it for myself to get it done, and to have something to do when I was sitting at home kind of alone in New York. So I eventually finished it. It took me 3 years, but I wasn't working on it constantly in 3 years. I worked on it for, I wrote pretty much 200 pages almost in a summer. And then I got lost. I got to 200 pages, and then I would realize like I went too many days without working on it, meaning like months without working on it. And then I kind of just forgot about it. And then I made a wonderful mistake. I trusted my father's agent, who's since passed away. His name was Phil Spitzer, and I had known him since I was a little kid because he was my dad's agent. And when I moved to New York, he and his wife kind of decided to treat me as found family and started inviting me to their house, and I became close friends with them. And I made the mistake of trusting Phil Spitzer with the secret that I had written 200 pages of a novel, and he got super excited. When can I read it? When can I read it? And I'm like, oh, I don't think I'm gonna finish it. And that little stinker, to this day, I'm like, don't tell my father. I said, don't tell my father, because like then I'll never hear the end of it. My dad would call me 24/7 and be like, send me the book. When's it done? When's it done? Why haven't you finished? So I'm like, you can't tell my father. I didn't tell him you can't tell anyone. I said, you can't tell my father. And then I was lucky enough that he represents Michael Connelly, and Phil did. And he invited me to their home for a book party for Michael Connelly. And have any of you read Michael Connelly? He's a very nice person, in addition to being a wonderful author. And he took the time at the end, I had met him as a fan a couple of times, as a reader, and he took the time at the end of the night to find me, and he's like, Phil said you're writing a book. And I'm like, oh, you just ruined my life, it's out. And I'm like, I'm not writing a book. And he's like, why does he think you're writing a book? And I'm like, 3 years ago, I started this book, and da da da. And he's like, so, he's asking me all the questions my father would ask me. Why haven't you finished it? What have you done? And I'm like, And I said, well, I'm like, I've got 200 pages. He goes, you have 200 pages? Because a lot of times when you meet people and they say they want to write a book and they're not done, sorry, podcast people, I talk very fast. Then you say, oh, do you read? No. Have you started writing? 2 pages. So when I said 200 pages, I think he was actually floored. And he's like, why haven't you finished? And I'm like, I can't figure out how it ends. And he goes, do you know who did it? And I went, yes. He goes, do you know why they did it? And I was like, yeah. And he waves over this other writer named Jonathan King, and he goes, she has 200 pages of a book, knows who did it and why, and doesn't think that she can finish it. And they looked at me like they wanted to kill me. They were just like, they're like, if you're not gonna finish it, give it to me, because I now know if you have 200 pages of a book and you know who did it and why, you're like basically done. It's all downhill from there. It's almost like if you're cooks, it's like you already did all the chopping, you already did all your sous chef stuff, and then to be like, oh, I don't think I'm really gonna finish it. So they were like, trust me, why can't you finish? I said, I can't figure out how it ends. And he said something to me that it's going to change how you read forever. He's like, if you're already 200 pages in, you basically shouldn't add anything new. Everything that you need to unwind the story and give that satisfying ending should already be there. So you need to go back in, read what you did, read it like a reader, come up with your possible solutions, pick one and write it, and hopefully it's not too obvious, and then you go back in and you plant some, he gave me a couple suggestions, whatever. So he signed his book for me that night. I can't wait to read your book. And I'm like, well, now my life is ruined because I can't ever talk to Michael Connelly again if I don't finish that book, and he hates it that I tell this story. But I finished, by then I was a law professor. I had the relationship with the doctor was over, but yada, yada, yada. Some things changed in my life. I was a law professor. I had a lot more time. I finished my last class of the spring semester. I took out my manuscript. I read it like a reader. I made notes of who all the characters were, what the clues were, things I hadn't said yet that probably should have been said. And I would have taught my last class the end of April, and I was done by July 4th. And so I always say, I just needed someone to tell me, you have no idea how close you are, just get back on it. And then I needed my inner, fear of being humiliated is the best motivation of all. I'm like, I can't have a book signed by a famous writer that says, I can't wait to read your book, and then just not finish it. So I finished it. I was very lucky. Phil Spitzer agreed to be my agent. There were several editors at the New York major publishers who were interested in it, which is great. He called me, he's like, oh, I've got an auction going. I'm like, oh, yay. And he calls me and he's like, oh, there's still 2 people in it, but they just want to clarify whether this is a series. And I went, do they want it to be a series? And he goes, no, I think they're all assuming it's a series. And I'm no dummy. I'm like, oh yeah, it's a series. Mm-hmm. Just like I planned it. Yeah, I can write another book in a year. Yeah, I've got lots more ideas. I can totally just keep doing this. So I signed a book for he called me back. I had a 2-book contract now I had a deadline. I had no ideas. All the ideas went to the first book. I managed to get that second book done, and then they asked me to write 2 more. And for years, I just kind of kept doing that. Oh, I can do this one more time. I was a full-time law professor. I was still writing for my tenure. I would write in my spare time, just like I had done when I was at the law firm. It was always just this 1-in-a-book time thing. Like, eventually they're going to get sick of me and not let me do this anymore. And until they tell me I'm done, I'm just going to keep doing this. And my husband, yada, 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 then I got married somewhere along. So my current husband, who's my 20-year husband, he is the one who pointed out to me that when we would meet people on vacation, strangers, things like that, if people asked me, oh, what do you do for a living? I would say I was a law professor, because then there's no follow-up questions. People just decide you're boring and they don't want to talk to you. And at one point, and it must have been, I'm going to say it was 8 books in, he's like, you tell people you're a writer now. And I'm like, I am a writer. Why would I tell people I'm not a writer? And he's like, you never used to tell people you were a writer. You never identified, you would tell people you were a law professor, and then it would come up that you also wrote novels. And at some point, it flipped. And he's like, you now tell people you're a writer, and it'll come up that you're also a law professor. So I still can't believe it's been 22 books, I guess, 15 by myself, plus all the books with Mary, which I'm happy to talk about if people are interested in that. My new book is, I've written 2 different series, the Samantha Kincaid series set in Portland, the Ellie Hatcher series. Ellie Hatcher is a detective, grew up in Wichita, Kansas, who is a detective in Manhattan. And then the rest of my books are standalone suspense novels. My most recent one is called The Note. It's about 3 friends who knew each other since they were kids at an arts camp. And they've kind of moved in and out of each other's lives the way people do, over decades. And they, in the last couple of years, for various reasons, you'll find out if you read the book, they live in 3 different places, but they kind of reunited as a group of 3 by text. I don't know if any of you have kind of ongoing text threads with either your family members or your friends. A lot of my friends are all over the country, and I've got different group threads, always going in my text messages. So the 3 of them, May, Kelsey, and Lauren, become important to each other again by Zoom and by text and by phone, but they haven't seen each other in real life for years, and they decide to let's do it, let's make a trip. And they go out to East Hampton together for what's supposed to be a lot of a fun weekend in the sun, and something that they do is sort of a stupid practical joke. When they get back together again, they're giggling like little girls again, and thinking of all the stuff they used to pull when they were young and reckless, and they do something as a practical joke that kind of goes sideways, and they wind up in the middle of a police investigation. And I think it's a really fun book. It's cold here. That book will make you feel like it's 80 degrees and you're on a beach. So I somehow timed my perfect summer read publication for January. So if you need a little fictional vacation to the beach, you can have one through this book. So I've been going around talking about that book, but also trying to introduce people to me and my work generally. The only other thing I have to report is a book that I wrote that shows how fast things move in Hollywood. My book, The Better Sister, came out in 2019, and on May 29th, Amazon Prime will premiere a television show based on that. That'll be fun. And I've seen it, so I can say it's good. It's really, really good. Starring Jessica Biel and Elizabeth Banks and Corey Stoll and Matthew Modine, and it's definitely when you watch it, you'll be like, hey, I know who that person is. I know who that person is. You'll be looking at IMDb. Where do I know that person from? So it's really beautifully done. The writers did a great job with it. Elizabeth Banks and Jessica Biel are going to get a lot of attention for these roles. Like, they pour themselves into it, and they capture, I don't know if any of you have read that book, but the heart of the book is this kind of complicated relationship between two sisters who used to be close, became estranged, and have to get back together again after somebody is killed, and they need to get together to protect this one of their sons. So, but the two actresses, Jessica Biel and Elizabeth Banks, really capture the dynamic, that complicated dynamic between sisters who love each other but kind of want to murder each other. They nail it. So I'm excited about that. That's May 29th.
With that, we have reached the part of our podcast where we turn to our Club Book audience for questions and comments for Alafair Burke and her work. In this book club, we like to encourage members and authors to connect and engage and help bridge the gap between the page you read and the process it took to write it. Our first question of the night comes from an audience member wondering how Alafair Burke found herself co-authoring with Mary Higgins Clark.
So this is one of the tricks of, if you write something in the first person, the character can't tell you anything that they don't themselves know. So every once in a while I have to tell you, and then something happened and I don't know. So I do know that she wrote a book called I've Got You Under My Skin. And one aspect of the book is that there is a television producer named Lori Moran, who is a producer of a show, a reality-based journalism show called Under Suspicion. And they reinvestigate cold cases by, they identify cases that were never solved, but there were always people who were, quote unquote, under suspicion. Like, everybody knows the husband did it, they just can't prove it, one of those kinds of cases. And they find those people who've been living under suspicion and other people who have firsthand knowledge of the case, and they kind of reenact the crime, and then they re-interview everybody to try to call attention to the case. So that was I've Got You Under My Skin, and she and her editor saw the potential for a spin-off with Lori Moran and the rest of her team as the cast of characters as a recurring series. Mary has had recurring characters in her books, like Elmira, for example, but they don't, it was never like a once-a-year series. Meanwhile, she wanted to keep writing her standalones once a year, and I guess in her early 80s at the time, I guess she didn't want to write 2 books a year. Such a slacker. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. But so they said, well, what if we pair you with a collaborator for the series books, and then you can still write your own standalone books and get 2 books a year that way, but somebody will help you. Then something happened, I don't know, and I get a phone call saying, there's a spin-off, and Mary Higgins Clark would like to have lunch with you to talk about co-authoring a series with her. And that was the fastest yes. I was like, I'm like, where are we meeting? The moon? I'll find a way. But we met at her house in New Jersey, and we had finger sandwiches, and we talked about books, and she had read several of mine and was a fan. And I'm like, what? And I had read many of her books, and including that one. And we got along, and we kind of agreed to try it. And that just meant, like, let's just write a couple of chapters together and see how this will work. But I think the way we knew it would work, and this is answering your second question, is when we decided we wanted to try it, we're like, okay, so logistically, how's this going to work? How are 2 people going to do this? And I said, well, do you outline? Because, you know, if there was an outline, you can just break it apart in pieces and dole it out, I guess. But she doesn't outline. She goes, do you outline? I said, no, I just make it up as I go along too. So we both kind of stared at each other like, can't have 2 people making something up at the, you know, off the seat of their pants at the same time. So I asked her, well, when you co-authored with Carol, because she had co-authored several books with Carol, her daughter Carol, I said, well, how do you and Carol do it? And she goes, she comes and moves into the house with me, and we sit down at the computer together and we write it together beginning to end. And I was like, do you want me to move into your house? And she's like, no. I'm like, okay, well, there goes that idea. And then we kind of decided to stop being so glib. And I said, okay, when we say we make it up by the seat of our pants, we're not really like, you're not waking up every day making something up randomly. So we kind of had to analyze ourselves and say, how do I know what happens next? And that's when I knew it. I think that's when we both knew it was going to work, is we figured out we need to know the characters first. And I'm like that with my own books too. You could give me a whole plot and I would say it's not enough, I can't start writing. Like I have to have the characters down because I don't know if that plot even makes sense until I know the characters, and I think the characters need to come first, not the plot. So when we realized we were both like that, we said, well, let's just talk about the characters. And you don't need a lot to start beginning about characters. And so just off of a true crime website, there was a story of a missing college student. That's all we had, a missing college student who was never found. And that became known as the Cinderella murder because we made it up that when she ran away, one of her shoes fell off, and the media started calling her the Cinderella case. So that's all we had when we started. So we were like, well, who's the student? And we decided that she had gone to LA to go to UCLA from somewhere else, and that her parents had a bad feeling about her going to LA and were scared for her, and just always had a sense of foreboding that that move to a big city wasn't going to be good for her. So then we started saying, so who are the parents? So then we kind of fleshed out who the parents were. And it was through that, we started just talking about the characters that, like, I'm getting chills right now because it was at the same time, that would give us the plot. It would be like, this is the thing that gets her in trouble. This is the thing that's going to have put her in danger. And then we kind of work backwards from that. And we suddenly had a plot, and then we started writing it. So I think what I learned from working with her is one, I think to the extent I still have my little law professor hat on, like in my first book, I really had it on, sorry. I really like that book, but there are some pages you can probably skip where she explains why she does or doesn't need a warrant, and I just want to go back in with a pen and be like, no, take that out. A lot of procedural detail and technical detail, if I would include that, she would just be like, they don't really need to know that. And I'd be like, yeah, you're right, they don't really need to know that. So I think it's made me a lot more, I'll edit myself, maybe a little more aggressively than I did before I worked with her. And I think she also, just because we had to go through that vocalization of our process, that I came to realize that I can't write until I know the characters. So when I feel like I'm writer's block or whatever, I mean, writer's block is always, it means something. There's no such thing as writer's block. Writer's block is, it's a descriptive state, meaning that you are not writing, right? It's not like you've got to figure out why are you not writing. And a lot of times for me, I realize I'm not comfortable with these characters yet, and I've got to kind of stop and do that work instead of just writing pages, if that makes sense.
This audience member asks if Burke has any input on who voices her audiobooks.
I do in a limited way. I mean, I don't go out there and hold the auditions. The audio companies, what they do is they give some thought. They should know the narrators out there, and they're the ones kind of making the casting decisions. And then what I'll get is they'll send me a list of maybe 5 potential narrators, and then they don't audition. That's the thing. They don't have to read a sample chapter, so that you don't hear them reading your book. You go online and you can get those excerpts, from Audible, like a free excerpt. So then you're looking up their previous audiobooks and listening to their samples, and you kind of just have to go from that. I won't use their names. There's a couple of narrators I've had that to me were so good that I would be willing to have them be like Will Patton, that's always the reader of my books. The audio companies kind of like to mix it up for reasons I'm not really sure about, but it would be nice in the future, because audio is becoming such a big part of the market, and I know that the narrator matters so much to people that it would be nice to find a narrator that seems to be able to kind of get my voice and my characters' voices on a consistent basis, so that readers kind of know what to expect, instead of because especially when if they binge your books, right, it can be jarring if they're binging them in an audible sense, of you're getting used to one person's voice, and then you go to the next book and you're like, ah! So, yeah.
This question is if any of Burke's characters are based on her.
Yeah, I think a piece of you goes into they're all you, right? So there's probably a little bit of you in every character. If you fall in love with a character and want her to be your best friend, it's totally based on me. If you hate a character, she's completely made up. No, I told you that. So when I started Samantha Kincaid, I kind of did pour a lot of myself into her. I just made her, a little more perfect than I am, and a little more crazy. But there's a lot of me in her. And then when I started a second series, for reasons that we could talk about, but when I started the Detective Hatcher series, there are writers who, I love their books, and I can enjoy them, but the characters don't change to me. It's kind of like, even though they're supposed to be standalone books and the characters are supposed to be completely different, I always just kind of picture them as the author. They don't seem that different to me. And I really wanted Ellie Hatcher to be different from Samantha Kincaid, not just her with blonde hair in New York, So I really had to draw on different parts of myself. And then with time, these three women, really, they're not like me at all. One of them, named May, is a much more, she's kind of, I don't want to say, she's the most insecure parts of me, like amplified by 10. And there are people who are like, oh, she drives me crazy, she's so insecure, but there are people out there who shouldn't be insecure, and they are, and I wanted to explore that. So, there's always little pieces of you, but I think if you're going to write more than one character, you have to, the best writers I know at character are real people watchers, and it's watching people in a non-judgmental way. It's being empathetic, because a lot of people, when they write books, they'll say, well, what would I do? Like, if all you do is give someone a plot, for example, if they're not thinking about character, they will say, well, what would I do in that situation? And then all your characters are going to be the same. They're going to reflect you and your sensibilities and your experiences. And I think to be a writer where the characters all stand out as separate and different, and where readers might learn something, about other human beings through your work, you have to ask yourself, not what would I do in that situation, but what would a person who's not like me do in that situation? So in the note, for example, May, who's a former prosecutor and a good girl and a rule follower, like, she wants to run off and call the police and tell them everything she knows. And one of the other characters is explaining why she's like, hey, if the police come to me, I'll cooperate, but I'm not sticking myself in the middle of a police investigation. And she has to explain to May, who doesn't have the experience to understand, why she's fearful of the police, right? Why she's worried about, if I inject myself into the middle of this, they're gonna come looking for me. So, I think that that's something that makes literature more interesting, if you have characters on the page who are different from the author and maybe different from your readers too,
Our next question is what Alafair Burke thinks about being a character in her father's books.
In his series of books where the main character is Dave Robichaux, in the second book in that series, he finds a girl who is a survivor of a plane crash, and she becomes his adopted daughter, and he names her Alafair. And so an important, and she has continued to be a character, and she, as a little kid, was incredibly irritating, in my opinion. I'm like, is she still baby talking? Come on. But as she's gotten older, she went to the same college I went to. She went to the same law school I went to. She has the same job I have. I'm like, okay, Dad, we got it. But there's an important biographical detail, which is, although when he finds her, she's 6, she's young when he finds her. I was in college. So I know that's when everybody goes, oh, yeah, I'm a lot older than that girl. So he called me, you got to remember when I said when I was younger, nobody had heard of my dad. He was out of print for 12 years. Like, there were no books. You could not find a James Lee Burke book to be bought. And so I started high school when that was his writing career. He had just gotten published again with a collection of short stories. He had a novella. He had a first crime novel called The Neon Rain, and then he called me. By then, it was good timing with the Neon Rain. He got a big enough contract for that I lost my financial aid. It wasn't enough to pay for my college, but it was enough for me the nightmares of student loan funding. So I was like, congratulations. And he's like, and you lost your financial aid and we can't afford your tuition. I was like, oh, okay, congratulations. But in any event, I was happy for him, obviously. We figured it out. I finished college. But the point is, college students like is not top of mind between like writing my papers and partying. Frankly, I was being like going crazy out of the house. You know, my once a week phone calls, because that was when you had to pay for a long distance phone call. You used to send your kids off to college without like FaceTiming them a million times a day. They said, you know, off I went happily, you know. But Sundays at 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock, I think, before 60 Minutes, because 60 Minutes is top of mind for the family. That was our scheduled weekly phone call. There'd be kids like, you know, the one pay phone, you know, calling. Blah, blah. So anyway, he calls me on my scheduled time for my once a week check-in, and he's like, oh yeah. In this second book, the follow-up to Neon Rain, he's like, he finds the girl on the plane, and he takes her to the hospital, and they say, what's her name? And he kind of panics because he doesn't know her name, and he picks his mother's name, which is Alafair, and I'm like, and he goes, do you mind? And I'm like, do I mind what? He's like, if I name this character Alafair, and I'm like, does she die? And he goes, no. And I'm like, I don't care. Like, because that would be creepy if she died, you know. So spoiler alert, she's never gonna die apparently. It never, just like it never dawned on me I would have a second book, let alone a 20-second book. It never dawned on me my father would be writing Dave Robichaux for 37 years. It's been that long, yeah. So I mean, I was 17, that's 38. 9 years, oh my God, I'm gonna stop doing math right now. So it's been a long time, and like she's now a grown lady, but no, it never dawned on me it would be that many years. I never had any idea that, you know, I've had so many people ask me if I'm adopted. No, I'm not adopted, birds and the bees way. Never had a three-legged raccoon. So that stuff's all fictional, but then you know, her left and right sneakers she used to wear, her little Donald Duck hat that quacked like I did. That was me. I really liked that quacking hat. It was so great. So yeah, those little details are me, and then the biographical details. But I never lived in Louisiana. Yeah, and so I think when people think, because she is me, obviously, but it's his version of a fictional, had she grown up with Dave Robichaux, right, as opposed to grown up as me. It's a bayou me, I guess.
Our last question of the night comes from an audience member wondering what Burke's book tour looks like.
So I started traveling the first week of January, and a snowstorm followed me all around for about 2 weeks. So some of that got rescheduled, and that took me all the way through January. And then I've continued doing like maybe 3 or 4 things a month in February and March. And I think that I do this. I leave tomorrow, and then there's an East Hampton mystery festival next weekend where they're going to do a sneak preview of The Better Sister, and then it's time to write the next book. Because as I explained to my editor, I'm like, when do you think I'm writing right now? She was like, do you have pages to show me? I'm like, take out your, look up alafairburke.com and hit events. No, I don't have any pages to show you. But this has been a very nice trip, and so thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
That wraps up our Scott County Library event with Alafair Burke. Make sure to catch our next podcast with Samantha Irby. Samantha Irby is a comedian and New York Times bestselling essayist and memoirist. Her singular voice shines through in essay collections that are equal parts raw and side-splitting. Fan favorites include Meaty, We Are Never Meeting in Real Life, and, most recently, Quietly Hostile. Visit us online at clubbook.org for details on past and present seasons, sign up for our e-newsletter, check out our calendar, and so much more. Stay up to date with all of our events at our Club Book Facebook page. If you're on Twitter, find us using the handle ClubBookMN. And if you enjoy these free Club Book events and podcasts, remember to share them with your friends. They just may too. Thanks again to all those who make Club Book possible, including Melsa, Library Strategies, in Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Our sponsors include Red Balloon Bookshop, where you can purchase all the books featured in Club Book. Finally, a very special thank you to all the libraries hosting events this season. That's it for Club Book, the coolest club in town. We'll see you at the library.